So with the Portland Trail Blazers making the 8th seed, I wanted to make a brief video breaking down their defense and why it is as bad as it is. The Blazers had a 120.4 defensive rating in the bubble, which ranked 3rd worst out of the 22 teams. And honestly, I'm kinda surprised that there are actually 2 teams worse than them, because this team really can't guard a traffic cone. And looking at their starting lineup, I don't think it's hard to see why. The first thing that should stand out is their front court, as the Blazers essentially play 3 bigs who can't guard on the perimeter. This big ball or tall ball, or whatever you want to call it strategy, goes completely against the grain of the mainstream small ball trend that has been dominating the NBA right now, and that has caused Portland to be on the wrong end of a lot of mismatches. Before we get into the film, let's go through a quick thought exercise that I'm sure has caused Terry Stotts a lot of grief. Who guards who in these starting lineups? We can start with the obvious easy one, Jusuf Nurkic guards Daniel Theis, but after that, things kinda devolve into a giant mess, where Portland doesn't really have anyone who matches up well against Boston's quartet of scorers. Zach Collins is a big, but Boston doesn't play any other bigs other than Theis, so maybe you just throw Collins on Hayward, who's the least athletic out of the remaining 4, and just hope for the best. But then that introduces a new problem with Carmelo Anthony. Hayward would have been the best assignment for Melo, but you can't have Collins on Kemba, Brown, or Tatum, so Melo has to guard one of Boston's 20-point scorers, whether you like it or not. So maybe you just put him on Jaylen Brown, the lesser of the 3 evils, then fill in the rest of the gaps, and soon before long you end up with a lineup that features 4 exploitable mismatches on defense. And the reason why this is relevant is because most teams in the modern NBA only play 1 big. So what did Brad Stevens and the Celtics do? They ran Gordon Hayward through screens because they knew that Collins wouldn't be able to chase a wing on the perimeter. Not many 7-footers in general can keep up with Hayward off stagger screens, and Collins definitely isn't one of them. And because they knew Collins was always going to be on a perimeter player, they sought out the mismatch in early offense before the defense was able to get set. This strategy was actually something the Clippers did a ton in their matchup against Portland because, like Boston, they also run a lineup of 4 perimeter players. They knew that Zach Collins and Jusuf Nurkic both can't be guarding Zubats, so they kept attacking whichever big was guarding a perimeter player. And because Portland wanted to keep Melo off LA's guards, one of Portland's 7-footers was seemingly always defending Reggie Jackson, which didn't go that well. The fact that it feels like I'm playing the same video over and over again shows how exploitable Portland's big ball lineup is against small ball. Going back to the graphic, another glaring takeaway from this is that Dame or CJ sometimes have to guard up a position because Melo can't guard most 3s. Dame had to guard Michael Porter Jr. and Jason Tatum in the bubble games, which is just a lot to ask from him considering the load he has to carry on offense. And the end result wasn't even that successful, mostly consisting of just a lot of seals down low for some easy layups or shooting fouls. So what can Portland do to fix their defense? My advice would be to stop playing 5-man lineups that feature Carmelo Anthony, Zach Collins, and Jusuf Nurkic all on the court at the same time. I think the stats make it pretty clear. You never want your starting lineup to have a negative net rating. And what we actually see is that when Portland replaces Carmelo Anthony with 3-and-D wing Gary Trent Jr., their offense drops off a little bit, but their defense improves by over 20 points per 100 possessions, albeit just an 8-game sample. And when Portland keeps Carmelo in and instead replaces Zach Collins with Gary Trent Jr., the Blazers see huge improvements on both ends, resulting in a dominant 15.7 net rating. While the main reason why Gary Trent Jr. makes this team so much better on defense is because of addition by subtraction, Trent still brings a lot of defensive value to the table. He relieves Damian Lillard from having to guard the opposing team's best player on the court, and he's also much more fit to handle these assignments, especially those above his position due to his peskiness and motor. Just watch these amazing ball denials against the 6'10 Michael Porter Jr. Just in general, Gary Trent Jr. is good at defense, which is a rare skill to come by in Rip City. His hands are like that of an Operation Board Game virtuoso, always accurately stabbing at and disrupting live dribbles. And while he may not be an impenetrable defender, his elite pickpocketing acts like a get-out-of-jail-free card for the occasions when he does get burnt. So with this all being said, I think the amount of success Portland sees against the Lakers will partially come down to one big factor: how they can minimize their big ball lineups. And I think you can subdivide this into two different parts. The first being how much defensive versatility they can get out of their role players, maybe like Mario Hezonja and Wenyen Gabriel. And the second factor, and probably the more important factor, is how much they can squeeze out of Gary Trent Jr., who improves their defense massively when he's on the court.